Welcome to this edition of On Politics. I'm Dr. Eric Morrow from Tarleton State University, and I want to welcome you today to the show. A lot happening over the week as we have seen so many things happening around the country with protests and with gatherings and just concerns that are being expressed over the actions of all different people across all different spheres related to the incident. George Floyd, the one who was asphyxiated in Minneapolis, and then the repercussions and consequences of that in terms of people engaging with this issue. And so we wanted to give attention to this on this week's show, especially with our focus in bringing more substantive analysis and looking at some of these critical issues and really trying to help our listeners to get a broader context to understand some of these issues. And so for the show today, I'm very pleased to welcome a colleague and associate in the college, Dr. Alex Del Carmen, who is our Associate Dean of the College of Liberal and Fine Arts. But more significantly, I think, in terms of his academic work, and not only that, his public service, he has been involved in the study of criminology for many, many years. He's authority on the topic of race and crime, with a particular emphasis on racial profiling in law enforcement. And in that, he has written numerous articles in internationally recognized journals, as well as published several books, and does presentations around the world. But a part of that as well is his direct engagement with law enforcement. And he has trained thousands of police officers, including all of the Texas police chiefs since 2001. And so his engagement with law enforcement at that level and looking at some of the challenges of this is just makes him one of the leading experts in the nation, if not the world, in kind of understanding some of these dynamics. So it's a privilege for us. He does interviews on CNN, Fox News, Telemundo, Univision, and NBC. And so I'm not sure if we have raised that a level now that you're on KTRL 90.5 FM from Tarleton State and Stephenville, Texas, but we're keeping good company there in that we have you on today. So thank you, Alex, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So really, for me, and we've discussed some of this leading up to the show and looking at all of these what's going on, the protests, the interactions with law enforcement, and we see so much attention is given to the violence, some of the protests that lead to really negative engagements with law enforcement or conflict, and of course we see a lot of these protests and things that are going on, and it seems like there's been some calming here in the last few days, but we see a lot of interaction here on multiple levels. And in terms of your experience in reflecting on this and seeing what's happening, I don't know how you can explain some of this. Is there an urban-rural aspect of it? Is it we have certain centers of population and maybe history of law enforcement that when these issues do come up, like we've seen in Ferguson, we've seen it in Baltimore, now we see it in Minneapolis, where it's just the conditions are there to for something like this to happen, and not just the actions of an individual. I mean, I know we see that and that's going to happen. It's the after effect. And so I didn't know, in your analysis and reflection on that, how do you look at the nation as a whole and kind of interpret or understand these kinds of things that flare up from time to time?
Yeah, so that's a great question, right? So if you look at the population and the number of police officers and police agencies across the United States, the FBI estimates that there are 1 million police officers in the streets of the United States today. And according to the FBI, there are close to 30,000 police agencies across the U.S. Most of them are in very rural, distant communities, right? So even in the state of Texas, 80% of agencies are not, the Fort Worths or the Dallases of the state. And so by virtue of that, what you tend to see is that agencies such as, the size of Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, they have so many police officers and so many interactions with the public on a given day that there is a greater likelihood, just by virtue of frequency, population density, and whatnot, that some of these incidents may actually emerge, right? So in this particular case, you have a case in Minneapolis, and you've got, thousands upon thousands of people, large communities where minorities reside, that are, many of them are poverty stricken. And so it's not surprising from a sort of sociological perspective that you would find that the eruption of anger, frustration, and to some degree violence that we have seen in the past week is taking place for the most part in these urban settings that are very diversified, that have greater concentrations of mass populations, and where there are thousands upon thousands of police officers. And so, folks that live in the rural areas of Texas and the rest of the United States are likely not going to see the sort of violence that we are seeing in cities like Boston, Miami, Chicago, LA, and Dallas.
Well, I think we saw that here in Stephenville this week when there was a gathering in the local park, and I think about 400 or 500 people attended, and it became much more of a community event with people just there to affirm their support. Yes, there was an element of protest to it, but it also was much more of a social type event, as well as affirming some of the different stances on critical issues right now. So we see that, and we also see the challenges of community leaders in addressing this, and knowing that certainly no one that's in any position leading a city or even a police force wants to see this turn into destruction of property and violence and all of that. But on the other side of it, in some cities like we've seen in Minneapolis now, they're having to navigate very challenging issues of what's going on within the police force, as well as putting forth the service of public safety in the midst of all of this. And so you have people coming together. It's very confrontational in watching it in the streets, where you've got people who are supportive of law enforcement, but then you've got people who are not, because of the way that they're looking at this entire issue. You've worked with police chiefs, you've worked with city officials for a number of years on a wide range of things. What are some of the things that these leaders are struggling with or trying to manage at this point in trying to get through this current crisis?
Yeah, so when you look at the instances or the events that took place before the death of George Floyd, right? So if you look at the Eric Garner incident in New York City, you look at other incidents throughout the United States that we've seen, and in Texas, Sandra Bland, a number of years ago. There's always been sort of a population of chiefs of police and police professionals that have looked at those incidents and have said, well, but there's always two sides to the story, and you've got to look at what the other side thinks and what the other side is doing. And so there was always that question mark. But in this particular case, it is different from anything that we have ever seen in the history of policing, in modern day history of policing, right? And I say that with the caveat that, to answer your question, many of these chiefs of police are just really scratching their heads. And as I wrote in my book, in fact, I actually called the publisher to ask them to send it back so that I could add about the George Floyd death, because I think it's such an important piece of history. And I wrote in there that this makes the unbelievable believable, right? And so many of the chiefs of police that never thought this was possible in modern day policing are now all of a sudden, after watching the video for 9 minutes and seeing this man struggle for his life, call on his mother, saying, I can't breathe several times, and the officer's knee still placed on this man's neck, they really are shaking their heads and they're saying, this is just absolutely unbelievable, right? And so I think the best way to answer that is, they're struggling themselves, right, with the acceptance that this actually happened in modern day policing, in spite of the significant efforts that many of us have tried to make in the past 2 or 3 decades, right, to bring the community to policing and vice versa. So I think that, and I've heard very, very, very forceful and very vocal statements from chiefs. I mean, to the extent that my good friend Art Acevedo from the chief of police from Houston, who publicly said 3 days ago that he had asked the family to give him the honor, using his words, not mine, of providing a police escort in George Floyd's funeral next week in Houston. And so like you really see that they're especially Texas chiefs. I mean, they're disgusted by it, and they are. I mean, a lot of them are embracing for impact as to what the the future requirements are going to be relevant to training, de-escalation tactics, and various other things.
Is this in a way it's showing them something that's still out there, or it's just it's kind of reared its ugly head in a different way or whatever? Or is this, I mean, I think the majority of people like to look upon our law enforcement and our police officers as public servants who have dedicated themselves to a vocation that is challenging far above many others, in that they're putting their lives on the line and at risk on a moment by moment basis in order to serve their communities, and so but this shows that there are that it's either certain people that are getting into law enforcement, or it's there are issues of training. I mean, where do you see this in those terms, so that in trying to help people kind of understand that, one, this is certainly not the norm. I mean, when you're talking about the number of law enforcement people across the country, but there is something happening here that goes back to the preparation of those who are preparing those to be those kinds of public servants.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I've always said, and I've trained, Eric, police officers for 22 years now. And if you go back and you ask the state, as I did recently, for the number, I've trained, I think, something close to 15,000 police officers and every chief of police, like you said. So I can tell you, I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I often say to people, 99.9% of police officers are decent, honest, hardworking people that get up every morning to sacrifice a lot of themselves and sometimes their own life in order to protect others. I mean, I've lost 2 police officers in the line of duty that have been former students of mine. And it's a very difficult thing. If you've never lost a friend or a colleague in law enforcement, it's very, very hard. There's not a day that passes that I don't say a prayer for them and for those that are alive, protecting our lives. But unfortunately, I think in the past 20 years or so, we have been slowly relaxing many of those entry requirements that we had in place, right? And so now, for instance, especially after the Ferguson incident, where many people just turned against police, social media did a great job of sort of, projecting that police officers were all racist and they were all evil people. And that had an effect, right, on the profession, in the sense that now there are less applicants. I mean, we saw that in our students that, came to the university that were seeking a law enforcement career. Many of them said, you know what, I'm going to go join the feds instead of joining local law enforcement because I don't want to be faced with those realities. And so I think law enforcement, in an effort to counter that and really panicking about seeing all these baby boomers retiring and many folks that have given 30 years to law enforcement retire, they basically started relaxing those standards. And I always say, look, at the end of the day, I've taught at police academies. I taught at the Arlington Police Academy for many years. I led the reform in New Orleans and the police academy there. And I can tell you, police academies, they only teach you so much. But if you bring somebody that has a heart that is not in the right place, and someone that has biases that are not correctable, you're going to have those issues pop up. And sadly, that's what happened in this case. So I always say that anytime you see an incident like the one we saw last week in Minneapolis, it is really the culprit behind this is that this person should have never been a police officer in the first place.
You've worked with city leaders. You've worked with state and federal officials as well. You've also been involved in, especially not just as a scholar, but engaged with reform efforts and looking at how police departments engage with these kinds of issues. How does that process work? I think a lot of our listeners may not be familiar with both the efforts that happen on the local and the federal level to look at what kind of structural or institutional or oversight changes need to happen. And I know some of it, like you said, it goes back to the selection of people, it goes back to the training, but also we've seen, like in Ferguson, where the federal government steps in to address some of the local issues that oversight is kind of critical in trying to hit the reset button and move forward. Explain kind of how that process works and what might happen, say in Minneapolis, or has happened in other cities where there's the need for outside authority to come in and say, okay, we've got to address some critical issues.
Yeah. So this dates back to President Clinton. When President Clinton was in the presidency, I believe it was his second term, he decided that he was going to put 100,000 police officers in the streets of the United States and open up a lot of grant sources for local agencies to apply for it. But in this presidential sort of mandate, he also inserted a section which actually is USC 14141, which is the federal code that allows for the federal government to intervene in local government policing in the event that it is shown that police department has a suspicious of what we call patterns and practices in my field. And so essentially what that means in English is that if you've got an agency that has systematic problems, right? For instance, you have multiple officers involved in shootings that are sort of questionable. You have, police corruption cases, and so the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, which is what Eric Holder, when he was Attorney General, he called it the gem of the Department of Justice, right? These are very bright, very skillful lawyers that a lot of them are very much the idealist in that they feel like their whole mission in life is to give the Constitution back to the people, right? So this very specialized unit, they will send their lawyers, literally deploy their lawyers to the scene as they did in Ferguson. And then what they'll do is they'll begin an investigation, right? And so they'll approach the police department. They'll sit down with the police department and say, we're here to investigate you. You have the option of either opening up, your books, or we'll see you in court, right? And a lot of police departments close up, which is sort of the nature, of law enforcement. And then what the Justice Department will do is they'll start digging. They'll do you can find, by the way, your listeners can actually go to the United States Department of Justice website, usdoj.gov. And you will see all the investigations are there. PDF, very, very hefty files. They can go through and read them. But they're fascinating because they go into search practices, policing tactics, training. So they sort of take away and they operationalize the entire police department into segments. And then they sit down with the police and the city and they say, look, we think we have a systematic problem here of patterns and practices. You have the choice of either settling this with us or we'll see you in court. And then if the agency says, you know what, I'll see you in court, and by the way, Ferguson did that initially, then they go to court, right? So good luck going against the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, in federal court. And so they do that initially, and sometimes in the steps of the courtroom, they'll quote unquote settle. And what that means is that the city will not give any kind of, large volume of money or any money at all to the government. That's not what the government is seeking, right? What the government seeks is police reform. And so what will happen at that point is they'll enter into an agreement. Typically, the agreement addresses every point of the investigation, and then it will be given to a federal judge. And that federal judge will decide which team or which individuals are going to serve on behalf of the federal judge as the eyes and ears in establishing police reform. And so by the way, I've served in that role, in the city of New Orleans. I was chosen to be one of the 7 members of the team. And it's kind of an interesting thing for an academic, right? Because you show up, from the academic world where, you're just one of many. And then they give you a badge, they give you an ID. The judge gave us her cell number. And they basically, you would walk in a place and immediately upon showing up, everyone was kind of tense because you work directly for the judge. You're pretty much deputized to be the eyes and ears of the federal court. And so one of the things that the judge said was, if anything happens to any of these individuals, it's almost as if you were going up against a federal agent, anywhere else. So we have federal jurisdiction. if I tell a police chief I want to see that drawer, I want to see what's inside, they have to open it, right? So if not, we get the U.S. Marshals involved, and so there's a lot of power that goes in there, a lot of authority, and also a lot of responsibility, because our job was then to help them help themselves, right? The idea is to say, you know what, your training is really mediocre. So you've got to look at your lesson plans, kind of like what we would do in academia, look at your lesson plans, get good instructors, measure, and it's very quantitative heavy. So you go in there and you measure their progress. And typically, and I'll finish by saying this, typically at the end, what gets you out of it is when you are 95% in compliance for 2 whole years. And so like, for instance, just to give you an idea, in Seattle, just about 5 weeks ago, they're finally getting out of their consent decree, which has lasted years. And so the judge over there finally was given the okay by the Justice Department, by the federal monitors, and the city, of course, agreed that they have achieved over 95% compliance.
Very good. Well, it's an interesting process, and it's I've through the work that you've done and the conferences that you've held, I've learned even more about this in terms of the impact on policies at the local level in terms of policing. I think a question here is, this happened, as you said, during the Clinton administration, or started in that direction. Do we see anything, and has there any? We have Baltimore, Ferguson, you mentioned New York as well. We've seen these kinds of incidents coming out of this. Do you see anything at the national, at the federal level, in terms of policy direction in the current process and the way it works, or how does situations when they come up like this kind of impact that going forward?
Yeah, so obviously the Justice Department in the Civil Rights Division is made up of career lawyers that are not political, right? These are people that work full time, for 20, 30 years, and then they retire. But there's a political component to it, which is the Attorney General, obviously, of the United States, is chosen by the president and whatnot. What we saw in the last consent decree under the previous President Obama took place in Baltimore, right? But it was interesting because it actually, they came into the consent decree right at the time that President Trump assumed office. But President Trump has been very vocal about the fact that he's not a supporter of these consent decrees. And when Sessions was the Attorney General, the same day that he left office, that he was fired by the president, he left a very scathing memo that essentially says these consent decrees don't work. I don't like him and all that. It's just a memo, but it does have some political significance. So what happened in Illinois is kind of interesting, because the Chicago Police Department was about to go into a consent decree, but the Justice Department, listen carefully here, the Justice Department opposed it, right? So it's like the first time in recent history that the DOJ said, no, we don't think you should enter into it. But who actually sued the Chicago Police Department was the Attorney General from the state of Illinois. And so what's fascinating about this is that they're currently under a consent decree, but that a federal judge oversees. They have a monitoring team in Chicago, but it is all essentially done with the ACLU and the state of Illinois Attorney General's office that oversees it. So the DOJ opposed it. The judge noted it for the record, and they still did the consent decree as planned. So what I see in Minneapolis, for instance, kind of interesting you asked that, because earlier today, about 2 hours ago, the local station in Minneapolis called me and they interviewed me, and they sounded really, really angry and desperate at the fact that the DOJ was probably not going to allow them to go into a consent decree over there. And one of the things that they said was, we do see the state of Minnesota coming in to sort of provide some sort of a police reform component, which they're certainly allowed to do under state and federal law, because DOJ is simply likely not going to get involved at that level. But that's all, to be honest, that right now, I mean, I don't know what DOJ is going to do. This is such a high profile case that I know that some of the people that I work with the Justice Department, and I communicate almost daily with, are very eager to start the process of an investigation once the FBI finishes that preliminary review. So I see that happening in Minnesota.
Right. Well, and how, so you look at this too, and you look at the challenges this creates within a community, between people in the community, law enforcement, different groups, whether they be a minority in terms of demographics in that area or not. There's clearly risks and challenges here. Uh, one question would be, it would seem to me that the consent decrees help to create an inclusive process, or at least I would hope that would be the case, where community leaders can come in and be involved in working toward a solution, which really is, it seems to be in line with our values of a democratic society, where we're trying to find consensus around the way we govern ourselves. But then, are there other options? I mean, it really seems like there needs to be healing, there needs to be reconciliation in these situations. What else would be an option in doing that, in terms of police reform or addressing the issues that lead to an incident like this? Whether widespread reform is needed, or if it's just some institutional adjustments, or what it may be. I mean, most average person on the street doesn't understand the complexity of administrating law enforcement, of policing. It's so complex. It's so regulated. It's so much dependent on training and recording and just being able to affirm the critical role that law enforcement has. So I'm kind of wondering that, because if the DOJ kind of backs away from that, or states lead that, and maybe that's caught in that mix of this should be a responsibility more of the states than the federal government. I don't know, but it just seems like that this is very critical in trying to find a way forward that brings a community back together to deal with issues that can be very, very divisive.
Right. And I think, you bring up a great point in your question, right? So you've got the Chicago model, as we call it, which is the attorney general sort of getting involved. But then, you also have the Fort Worth model, right? So as you know, in Fort Worth, last year we lost Tatiana, and this was that was certainly a shooting that should have never taken place. And so the city council came together, and basically the city manager called me and said, hey, can you help us put together a team of experts that can help us review some of the patterns and practices of the police department. And although I'm not at liberty to talk about what we're doing there, but I will tell you that in a few weeks from now, we're going to disclose, we're going to release our preliminary report. And we've been working with the former head of the Civil Rights Division for DOJ, Jonathan Smith, Emily Gunson, who was another DOJ lawyer until last year. So we're working with people that are high caliber, that they do this, as a matter of for years now, doing it on behalf of the government. So it's an interesting model, right? That you have a local city that basically the city council comes together and says, we think we need our own review, but we're not going to, we really want experts from the outside to come in and look at it and tell us what's broken, what's wrong, and let's fix it, right? So I think that's kind of an interesting perspective. As far as I know, Eric, I think this is the first one of its kind in the United States. But I know that we've received a lot of interested people that have called us and said, hey, so when you're done over there, can you come look at our stuff over here, right? Because they see it as a proactive measure, as a liability reducer, because if you've got experts that you've called in to say, help me understand what's wrong and help me fix it, the likelihood of somebody that's going to turn around and say you're hiding stuff is probably nil to none, right? So I think that there is there's that model as well. So I think you have the federal government, you have the state government, and then you've got these sort of self-initiated local community based, let's get a team of experts to come in and review what we're doing model. And maybe the answer is in all three of them, right? I will tell you, and I'm more of a state rights person than a sort of a federalist in that regard. But I will tell you that there are times and there are instances and circumstances in policing where federal intervention is absolutely crucial and needed. And I used to not think that way. If you would have interviewed me on that question, 7 years ago, I would have said, no way, there are no instances. But I really have seen the sort of progressive decayance of that sort of really, that inner culture of hiding, of institutional chaos, of corruption, that it does require for people that have no political economic or otherwise affiliation to the city, to government, locally, to come in and just basically say, I'm giving you a perspective that's very much objective, and it's not subject to the local pressures that they may find.
Well, I think that's probably where the scholarship on this comes in and helps as well, because you look at other policy areas where some of the intervention at the federal level over time has been because of the lack of transparency and the inability of state and local governments to conform or follow the basic norms of law that are in the Constitution. We've had constitutional amendments that have addressed this. We've had have thousands of court cases. I mean, it's just so we are in an era where you see sometimes more latitude there in trying to find the solution. And when you have a model like what you're saying with Fort Worth, where you get outside expertise, and this would be, I guess, a question too that in your experience, but just seeing and training police officers, police chiefs, but seeing the level of professionalism, the level of skill and ability in terms of leadership. And I think that's a very positive message to people in our communities that this is characteristic of much of law enforcement today, and is even probably moving in a direction where that level is going to be higher in the future.
Absolutely. About maybe 14 years ago, I had the opportunity, which I will never forget, of meeting Dr. Herman Goldstein, who was the academic that brought the concept of community policing, to the world. But he's the guy that coined the phrase, right? And he was very old at the time that I met him. He has passed since, but he and I met, and we had a great conversation in Arlington, where the local chief brought him to give a talk. And so I had a chance to have breakfast with him. And he said to me, Alex, he says, in the next 20, 30 years, there's going to be a need for more academics and more academic types in policing than anyone recognizes. Because the need to understand data, the need to understand, the patterns of policing, it's crucial. And that's where I found my passion. And I've never shared this with you before. And I guess it's good that I share it with you now and during this interview. But that's where I found my passion for what I do, to bring the academics with the practitioners to sort of embrace them, right? Because I learned from him, and I learned from my experiences that here are these two worlds that I'm part of, right? So I'm part of the policing world, and I'm part of the academic world. And if we just kind of let our egos down and sort of talk to each other instead of at each other, we would really find that there are a lot of things that we can do together. Like I was telling my doctoral class this past Saturday, because as you can imagine, this touches the hearts of many of our students, because many of them are practitioners. And so it was sort of like I had this whole lecture prepared, and then and this happened. And so it kind of, all right, let's talk about the elephant in the room, and let's talk about what we need to talk about. And many of them were just very upset, and they had very sort of, interesting perspectives that they share with the class. But I thought, from my perspective, there is a significant, and I wouldn't say a need. It's urgent. It's an urgency. There's a mandated need for our students at Tarleton State University to learn data, to learn how to measure things, to learn how to operationalize things, so that when they go into the world of policing, they can help these leaders quantify their problems and address them accordingly. I cannot tell you, Eric, how many times I have been asked by a police department, I mean, maybe thousands of times without exaggerating, to help them with a quantification of data sets, with an explanation of their data, to put things in context for purposes of their city council. And I will never be appreciative enough to those professors that I had 1,000 years ago in grad school that taught me how to research, right? Because I see, like, what we do and I show up to the classroom and I give them real life examples, right? I use things that I've used, like looking at the protest in New York, just yesterday, I was reminded of where I was last summer in Puerto Rico, where I was at the gubernatorial mansion, watching people throw bottles of water and acid at police officers. Like, what academic gets a chance to do that, right? And at the same time write about it, which is now in my book. But so I just think that for our students, in the future, if there is anything that I want to leave your listening audience with, both those of us that are academics and also the students as well, is there is a substantial need to just be part of both worlds and to help them, right? Because we are not going to arrest our way out of these problems. We are not going to use the baton out of these problems. We have to use our brain and the quantification of data in order to be able to better understand and make better police officers out of our, and also educate the public, right? That's a big factor too.
Right.
You said that in your question. I think you're spot on. Many people don't understand the complexities of policing, right? And quite frankly, people don't want to understand it. They call 911. It's like, you know what? I heard a noise. The officer shows up. They clear the scene, and then they're like, "Please leave the premises right away because the value of my home is going down by the presence of your police unit." You know, so it's like we love them when we need them, but we don't like them when we don't need them, right? So it's sort of like it's an interesting component, but we also need to educate the public as well.
So on that note, what are some things that you would say to the general public in a crisis like this, where they see this going on all over the country, in terms of what they can do in their communities to address these issues, to address them in a positive and productive way for the benefit of the communities, but certainly for the role that law enforcement, the critical role law enforcement has in their community?
Well, first and foremost, I would say to them that what happened in Minneapolis is unexcusable. Before we even talk about ways that the community can help or get involved, it is what it is, and it's unexcusable. It's illegal. It's murder, and I think that should never happen in America again. And I will say that's the exception, not the norm in law enforcement. But I would say that for people out there, it saddens my heart when I see folks destroy property and engage in violence in these protests, because I think a lot of the message of the peaceful protesters is getting lost in the violence that some people perpetrate. But I think the rest of us that are sort of watching this from afar or from our homes, I think we have a responsibility. Like Jack Kennedy was told by his father at one point when he said, why should it be me that runs for office? And his dad said, if not us, who? And if not now, when? I think that for your listening audience, I would say to them, it's really time. It really is time. If there's anything that we need to do after the incident last week, is get involved, right? Is go to your local police department and join the Citizens Police Academy, which is a wonderful opportunity for people on a very part-time basis, like once a month, to spend 2 to 3 hours with your local police agency, learning about their job and what they do. Support the understanding, the promotion of education in law enforcement as well. We have a great program at Tarleton in criminal justice that I think people need to know what we're doing there to educate that not only the future, but the current police officers as well. But more than anything is to be informed, to get involved, and to be engaged, right? Because it is the 80% of the community right now that is that silent majority that needs to be involved, right? Because we're letting some people sort of define the rest of us by their political actions, and that should not be the case. We should be fair about this. We should be honest about the dialogue, but we need to be engaged. We've got to get out, get off our couch, get off our ritual that we do every day, and simply get involved with your local police department. Try to understand it, be part of it. We have amazing people in our community, great educators, people that teach ethics, people that teach, and they can get involved in their local agencies by helping out. You look at Stephenville Police Department, just a few blocks away from the university, and we have a new chief there, who's great. Great leadership with Jason King before him. But we need to engage them and support them, right? And be supportive of what they do. It is one of the toughest jobs in the world. And they need to just hear from time to time that we understand it and that we expect a lot from them. We expect the Constitution to be part of their services that they render to our community.
Well, I've been joined today by Dr. Alex Del Carmen, Professor of Criminology and Associate Dean in the College of Liberal and Fine Arts, and a close colleague and friend, but certainly a internationally recognized expert in criminology with his wide range of experience in engaging with police officers, police leadership, and in their training. And so I just want to thank you today for joining us. We've covered a lot of ground in a short period of time, but hopefully it brings to our listeners that a level of engagement they might not otherwise have in trying to understand some of these critical issues during this critical time. So thank you for joining us today.
And thanks for having me. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
You're very welcome. We're going to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back with more On Politics.
We are excited to announce that KTRL 90.5 FM is now streaming online. Tune in anytime to catch your favorite shows from Tarleton Public Radio. Relax and enjoy the best of NPR News, classical, jazz, and all of our local programs like Essential Jazz, Beatles and Beyond, and more. To listen to your KTRL favorites, visit tarletonradio.com or click Listen Live at ktrl.fm.
Hello, I'm Janice Horrock, and my radio home is KTRL 90.5 FM for news.
From Feature Story News in London, I'm Ollie Barrett.
Sports.
Touchdown, Tarleton Texans!
Jazz and classical music.
Politics can be confusing, but On Politics with Eric Morrow has your back. Follow the show on Facebook. Search On Politics with Eric Morrow to stay up to date with the show and all the sources to follow right along.
Welcome back to On Politics. I'm Dr. Eric Morrow, and we want to thank you for joining us today, especially for that very extensive and in-depth interview with Dr. Del Carmen, especially in looking at the protest and all of the related issues connected to law enforcement and some of the challenges that we've seen over this past week. And I want to, here at the end of the show, turn to another issue that has raised some concern and presented some challenges. As you may know, I'm not one to shy away from the intersection of religion and politics, because that is what I teach and research, in addition to public policy and a few other areas. But this intersection is always very engaging to me, especially when you look at it in terms of the political dynamics and how religious identity, religious faith and practice, especially advocacy in terms of policy, enters into the public sphere and then leads to a wide range of outcomes. And it's very unpredictable, it's very challenging, it's very unique in this country, given the relationship that we have and the diversity that we have. But many people have seen already and have seen and are in tune with the controversy that came when President Trump earlier in the week walked across from the White House to the St. John's Church there and hoisted a Bible for what appeared to be a photo op. And part of this, as some were saying, was to connect with religious conservatives in the midst of all this crisis and challenge, as a part of his reelection plans, as a part of connecting with the constituents that have supported him. Others looked at it as in a positive way of saying, well, here in the midst of a crisis, the president is trying to affirm some of the principles that should be guiding us in that. That's a little difficult to surmise that because there wasn't much commentary that went with it. I mean, it was a matter of clearing the streets, making a way, the president going over and taking a photo op. And then others have been very, very negative about it. In fact, it did have an impact on a number of national religious leaders who were supposed to meet with President Trump this week. And because of that and the issues it raised among religious groups, that meeting was canceled. And so it was really a kind of a sign here of a tension between religious leaders and what happened with President Trump doing what he did, the photo op with the Bible. Now, I'm not here today, and I don't have enough time really to dig into this in terms of the facets of it, say from religious communities and perspectives of religious leaders. Really, I looked at this, and one of the things that's always very challenging at the intersection of religion and politics is how religion is used by politicians. And if you know on this show, I'm very adamant and very consistent in not necessarily judging those actions one way or another, but looking to understand them. Why do politicians, why do political leaders engage, and how do they engage with religion, whatever it may be, the way in which you engage with specific religions or religious symbols, and what is the purpose behind that? What is the motivation behind that? And I think this is a prime situation here to look at this in terms of what are the political motivations. It's very clear, and we can go back and look at this in terms of President Trump himself, and he's not someone that has practiced religion extensively. It's been very clear that his really knowledge of the Bible or of religious faith in general is limited. And so one of the challenges here is what is his motivation in doing this? What does it mean in terms of a statement to people of faith or religious communities, or what does this mean in terms of a political opportunity, using the moment in order to make connections with constituents? I tend to lean in that direction with this more than anything, just simply because of what I said first, in that President Trump has not shown to be an overtly religious person, and he's engaged with religion throughout his career, and especially in his time in running for public office and serving as president, more in terms of what it means for his presidency and what it means in terms of his constituents and the political outcomes that he's trying to achieve. I go back to the national prayer breakfasts. If you go back and you look these up online, these are breakfasts that bring religious leaders across the nation together to talk about critical issues. It's focused on prayer and the importance of that, not only in terms of religious faith, but in terms of what religious faith and religious identity brings to addressing these very challenging issues in our country and our society. And the role the president has had in those prayer breakfasts has been very focused on him as a person, very focused on his political goals, his policy agenda, and often delivered in a way that doesn't really necessarily connect with the prevailing ideals and values of religious communities. So if you look at that in terms of an analyst, not weighing, where's truth, where's right and wrong in this, the connections have been very, very challenging. And so what we see with this photo op and with him, what he did this week, is something very similar. In one way, he's seeing it as an opportunity to support people with strong religious identity, to connect on that level and in that way, not with a direct application of what, say, religious faith or identity would say about what crisis we're having right now. And this is where he received a lot of criticism for this. This is where religious leaders came out and said, well, there's no substance here. How is this dealing with issues of racism, of racial injustice, of police brutality, of these challenges within communities that continue to have these very significant issues that are rooted in racism and other elements that need to be addressed directly. And so this is where some of that criticism came out, is that, okay, where is the leadership or the direction here? And I think this is one of the things that continues to plague the president and will leading up to the election. And it's not just in this area, it's in the midst of this crisis, but really when you move it into this intersection of religion and politics, it can become even more divisive. And it'll be interesting to see what the ongoing perspective is of those among very strong religious communities. I mean, early polls that have come out in the last few days show that he has been losing ground among religious conservatives, among evangelicals. It's certainly not at a level that would say, well, they're not going to vote for him in November, but it is enough to say, okay, well, you add this up with all the other groups that are either motivated to vote more numbers, more people voting in certain groups, or the constituents that he had at the beginning of his presidency that helped him to elect. It could have a difference. But what the challenge is here, and this is where, if we're looking at this from the political dynamics, it's for his political strategist. And so this was being viewed as an opportunity to reconnect, and try to strengthen that connection with his religious base. But they really missed the mark with it, because for one thing, I should say, there wasn't that substance there. It was just what it was. It was a photo op. There was no engagement at a depth that said, okay, let's look at the elements, the values, the ideals of religious faith and identity, and how those speak to these current and critical issues. That's where the part that's missing that really needs to be there. I mean, and this is, again, something I've gone back to throughout all of his presidency, is that you surround yourself with people, because you're not an expert on most issues, but you surround yourself with people who can communicate, who understand the depth of these issues, and who really work in terms of your messaging so that it connects, not just in a symbolic act of doing something, but it has a substantive purpose and focus there that helps provide leadership when it's needed. And I think this was one of those opportunities. It could have been the same photo op, but it could have been the president delivering a very strong message, and instead the optics of it got in the way. The optics of evacuating priests from the church, of pushing out all the protesters forcefully in order for the president to do this. All of those things overshadowed any attempt at gain through this. And so the critical thing, I think, going forward, and we'll come back to this on some other issues in future episodes, is where is the strategy in this? Where is the political strategy to use this to its full effect, to connect with people when they are looking for leadership? So I want to thank you for joining us for the show today, right here on 90.5 KTRL FM. We are streaming online for the show each week at tarletonradio.com. We are also available on SoundCloud after the show to listen or download where you get your podcast. And I encourage you to join us each week here at 12 noon on Sundays for more on politics.
This has been a Tarleton Radio Network podcast with production from AJ Heyer and Taylor Welch. Find more great shows by searching Tarleton Radio Network wherever you get your podcasts.